I'm Emily Chang. This is the best of Bloomberg Technology, where we bring you all our top interviews from this week in tech. Coming up, the former chairman of the FCC, Tom Wheeler, slams the plan to roll back net neutrality. Wheeler joins us to discuss what he calls a shameful sellout. Plus, another huge setback for Uber. The company concealed a hack affecting 57 million accounts, then paid the hackers to delete it and keep it quiet. And HPE announces CEO Meg Whitman's departure. We'll dig into her tenure at the company and the tough job that awaits her replacement, Antonio Neri. First to our lead. This week, the Trump administration took a big step towards voiding the Obama-era net neutrality regulations. Current FCC chairman Ajit Pai announced on Tuesday that he plans to hold a December 14th vote on overturning the protections. These regulations are intended to prevent broadband providers from favoring their business partners' offerings or their own video and other content. Pai spoke with Bloomberg Radio to defend his decision. Take a listen.
The FCC would require that all internet service providers be transparent about their business practices. If they're blocking or throttling content, they have to disclose that. And additionally, we make clear that the Federal Trade Commission would have authority to police broadband providers if they're behaving in an anti-competitive way. And so through those two rules, we would be able to protect consumers going forward and promote investment in the networks that are necessary to promote digital opportunity.
We caught up with his predecessor, the man who led the FCC during the Obama administration when those protections were instituted, former FCC chair Tom Wheeler.
Transparency is the solution. So all that is necessary to do something evil is to tell you that I'm about to do something evil. That doesn't make any sense. And then, okay, what do you do once you have that information? 2/3 of the households in America have no other choice as to where they're going to get their internet. So this is, to go out and claim that somehow this is some kind of consumer protection is a fraudulent representation.
They say their proposal is more fair, more pro-consumer. What makes you think it's actually the opposite?
Well, I mean, in the name of consumer protection, they say they're not going to protect consumers. In the name of better regulation, they say they're going to turn it over to the FTC. But yet, an FTC commissioner, Commissioner McSweeney, this afternoon tweeted that even if they do that, the FTC doesn't have any authority. They're just running away from their responsibilities.
The big concern here is how this impacts the haves and the have-nots, the folks who could increase future innovation, be responsible for future innovation. How would this impact the haves of the moment, the Googles, Facebooks, Netflix?
Well, I think the important thing here is how does it affect everybody and their ability to get on the internet, and for consumers to reach providers and for providers to reach consumers. You know, what we're seeing here is the cableization of the internet. If you like your cable company and the way in which they choose which channels you can see and the way in which they continue increasing their prices, you're going to love what happens under this repeal, because suddenly the people making the rules are the networks, and the consumers can't survive without the networks, and the service providers can't survive without the networks.
So how can we hold ISPs accountable?
Well, that's what we did on our open internet rule. We said, hey, there's some bright line rules that you've got: no blocking, no throttling, no paid prioritization. You got to provide information to the consumer, and we will put a referee on the field to look at what your continued actions are as technology evolves and throw the flag if necessary. And what the Trump FCC is doing is just turning its back and walking away and giving the network companies everything that they have asked for.
This is unfolding against very interesting political backdrop. Of course, we just mentioned earlier what's going on with AT&T's proposed merger with Time Warner, the DOJ now suing AT&T. How much of this is politically motivated?
I can't answer that question. I do find it shocking that that the Trump FCC from day one has gone right down the line for what the big companies want when they're supposed to be representing consumers, not the companies. And consumers, the FCC continually turns their back on their congressional mandate to protect consumers.
Look, by all accounts, it appears that this will happen in December. For you, what is it like to watch your work be undone?
I've had better Thanksgivings. No, Emily, I think that the answer there is that this is a long process, and that yes, it appears as though they have the votes to overturn it in December. Then it'll be up to the court. The decision that we made twice went through the court and was twice affirmed by the court. And I hope that the court will look at this and say, hey, wait a minute. This has been in effect for 2.5 years. And there haven't been bad things that resulted. Why are they turning around and going the other direction?
That was Tom Wheeler, the former FCC chairman. Now, let's get the other side. Robert McDowell is former Republican FCC commissioner who served under both Presidents Bush and Obama and joined us right after Wheeler in support of a rollback.
What's happening is we're going back to where things were in 2015, and actually what Ajit Pai is putting back into place is Clinton-Gore administration policy. So the internet ecosphere, I think we can all agree, was exploding beautifully before 2015, before these old 1934 rules under the 1934 Communications Act, something called Title II, was put on broadband internet access. And so you have Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act, you have Section 2 of the Clayton Act, you have Section 7 of the Clayton Act, actually. You have a lot of protections. You have the terms of service by each broadband internet service provider, which is a contract with consumers. Look, if they were to discriminate in a way that harms consumers, there would be an avalanche of class action lawsuits, for instance. So there are so many protections that were already in place in 2015 before this thing called Title II was imposed into the internet ecosphere. So it's actually going to be just fine. The sky is not falling. There's not going to be some internet dystopia coming. It's going to be the same place, better place, actually, as we look to invest $300 billion in new mobile technology, 5G technology that we're going to need over the next decade to have America continue to lead the world in wireless and really wire up the Internet of Things. So it's going to be a great decade coming up.
We just got a question in from a viewer who asks quite plainly, how does this actually help consumers?
Right. So what we've seen since 2015 is a stutter step in investment in broadband networks. A number of studies are out there, a number of independent studies and market analyses that CapEx has been curtailed a little bit in this space because, as you had in a previous segment, the sword of Damocles of rate regulation has been swinging over ISPs. So Title II was created for the Ma Bell phone monopoly in 1934, and it has about 1,000 different requirements. And so the FCC became sort of the agency of Mother May I. Can we innovate? Can we zero rate in a way that's pro-consumer, for instance? And the FCC was this bottleneck all of a sudden for innovation and experimentation in the marketplace. Keep in mind, by the way, that consumers, over 90% of consumers have a choice of 4 mobile broadband providers. Contrary to what Tom was saying, in mobile broadband speeds are much faster now than DSL or cable modem speeds were even just 10 years ago. And they'll be 100 times faster after we wire up or have wirelessly connected with 5G, the Internet of Things. So it's going to be a wonderful time.
How do we hold ISPs accountable, though, when this is mostly honor system based?
It's not honor system based. There are many laws already in effect here. So what prevented ISPs prior to 2015, prior to Tom's order, from behaving in an anti-competitive way that harms consumers? It was Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act. It was the Clayton Act. It was state attorneys general and the plaintiffs bar, quite frankly. But it was also economic incentives. It was the market. You have a competitive marketplace for broadband, and it's primarily mobile broadband. We see cord cutting and cord shaving. And we see, you know, if I watch my kids, they're watching their video on over the top on devices like this through mobile broadband connections. It might be licensed, it might be unlicensed. So you had market pressure, and you had other laws already on the books prior to 2015 that protected consumers, it protected entrepreneurs, it protected investors, and it gave us this great internet ecosphere that we enjoy today. So it's a myth that somehow consumers are unprotected after what the FCC is doing. Quite the opposite.
Now, we've also been talking about the DOJ suing AT&T over its attempt to acquire Time Warner. Earlier with Tom Wheeler, we were talking about how much of all of these issues are politically motivated. I'm curious for your thoughts on that.
I worked very closely on a lot of deals. So you saw, for instance, SiriusXM or AT&T's attempt to buy T-Mobile, all while I was there, many big deals. And we worked closely with the Department of Justice and sometimes the Federal Trade Commission on these deals. So what we're seeing is a reinvention of antitrust law, or an attempt to do so with this complaint. You know, there's a reason that the government hasn't challenged a vertical deal where a distributor is buying a supplier in nearly half a century. And that's because they tend to fail or there's no competitive harm. So right now the jurisprudence, the case law, is really stacked against the government. The government has the burden of proof here. And we're going to see an interesting case. I mean, get the popcorn out, because there are two companies in America that know the most about antitrust law. That's Exxon, the old Standard Oil, and Ma Bell, AT&T. And AT&T was willing to go to court in 2011 in a horizontal merger where they were buying a competitor, T-Mobile, but it was the FCC that actually killed that deal. But they were willing to go to court there, and they're more than willing to go to court and win. I think the government has a huge burden to overcome, and would really be creating a new paradigm and a new precedent here as they try to argue in court. So get the popcorn out. It's going to be an interesting couple months.
That was former FCC Commissioner Robert McDowell. Still ahead, Uber's hacking cover-up deals a huge setback to its turnaround effort, and newly appointed CEO Dara Khosrowshahi finds himself in apology mode again. And if you like Bloomberg News, check us out on the radio. You can listen on the Bloomberg Radio app, Bloomberg.com, in the U.S. on SiriusXM. This is Bloomberg. This week, we learned Uber covered up a massive hack attack affecting 57 million accounts. In 2016, hackers stole the personal data of 50 million customers and 7 million drivers. Uber and then CEO Travis Kalanick kept the breach concealed for a year. This week, the ride-hailing company ousted Joe Sullivan, chief security officer, and another executive for their roles in keeping the hack under wraps. Rather than report the breach, Uber paid the hackers $100,000 to delete the information. Bloomberg Tech's Eric Newcomer broke this story and joined us with more.
More than a year ago, Uber heard from these hackers that they had found a way to get information, names, telephone numbers, that sort of information on 50 million riders, and then information on 7 million drivers, and most importantly, driver's license numbers for 600,000 drivers. And the concern here is that that's information that Uber was required to disclose and didn't. And so now, more than a year later, with a new CEO, Dara Khosrowshahi, the company is deciding to come forward and say that they should have disclosed this information, and here's what happened.
So Dara Khosrowshahi telling you none of this should have happened. I will not make excuses for it. We are changing the way we do business. Uber has been negotiating with regulators over privacy issues now for a long time. What makes them think that they could get away with something like this?
Yeah, while they were talking to the Federal Trade Commission, and just after negotiations with the New York Attorney General, they faced the question of what to do about this hacking. And it's hard to imagine this engenders any sort of trust with regulators. You already saw in the instance in London where regulators there revoked Uber's license, that part of the issue is they just didn't trust Uber and that the company hadn't really represented very clearly what had gone on. And this is yet another sign that Uber was willing to go to great lengths to hide information that it now believes it was required to report from regulators. And that's certainly going to give cities, states, and national governments all over the world serious pause.
Now, how can we be sure that this information didn't get into anybody else's hands and that the hackers did indeed delete this information?
Right. I mean, normally hackers will sometimes wait and sit on information, so that's certainly a concern. I think Uber's belief here is that they did pay the $100,000. They had evidence, perhaps, that the files were actually deleted. We don't know who these hackers were, but they refer to them as, these two individuals. So I think right now there's a belief that that information isn't out there in the public, and of course Uber is offering, data protection for the drivers affected by the most serious information breach here.
So what did former CEO Travis Kalanick know, and when did he know it?
Always a good question. I mean, a lot of this falls to Joe Sullivan, their chief security officer, who is also their deputy general counsel. He's now been ousted as part of this, along with another senior attorney. Kalanick certainly knew in November 2016 that this hack had taken place. He knew the company had been negotiating with the Attorney General's office in New York and the FTC. There are questions about how much he knew the legal reasoning and legal obligations behind this decision, but he certainly knew about the hack and knew about the scrutiny that Uber faced from regulators and Attorney General's offices. So
what kind of penalty could Uber face here? Could they face some sort of consequences from regulators? Could they be hit with a lawsuit, in fact? Yeah, I think that anything's possible. As we've reported before, Uber faces sort of ongoing criminal probes that have touched on at least 5 different areas. So this is a company that, over time, regulators and law enforcement officials are looking at. So, and there are dozens of civil suits against Uber. So it certainly wouldn't be surprising that something like that could happen. But I think we just have to wait and see what the actual consequence is. I mean, but you have to imagine that some sort of monitor or attempt to make sure that Uber's doing what it says it's doing is something that regulators or law enforcement is going to be thinking about after these revelations. Now, I know it may be hard to keep track of all of the open investigations, but what do we know about the status of those and whether we're likely to see any kind of penalty? We haven't heard a lot new since sort of my big story last month saying that there were these 5 investigations. And I think one interesting fact here is that Joe Sullivan, who's been ousted as part of this incident, was sort of at the center, or at least his organization was at the center of some of those things. You hear about Grayball, the software meant to help, in some cases, Uber drivers evade law enforcement. That was something Sullivan's team was responsible for and something that investigators have looked at and may still be looking at. So there's so many questions still that Dara Khosrowshahi really has to keep playing cleanup, and he knew that was what he was coming into. Maybe he didn't know quite the extent of it because, again, this one, the data breach, is a total surprise. I mean, Uber has so many problems, and the idea that there's a new one is just shocking. Well, according to Bloomberg data, Tesla is spending an average of $8,000 per minute as it ramps up production on its all-important Model 3 sedan. That would put the company on track to exhaust its current cash pile by early August, though the pace is not expected to continue. Tesla has said it has ample money to meet its target of producing 5,000 Model 3s by the end of March. Coming up, the DOJ is hitting AT&T hard. Details on the lawsuit that could block AT&T's $85 billion takeover of Time Warner ahead. This is Bloomberg. Big news for Tencent. The tech giant has become the first Chinese company to be valued at more than $500 billion. This coming just 3 months after it topped $400 billion for the first time ever. Tencent joins Apple, Alphabet, Amazon, Microsoft, and Facebook as the only companies valued at more than $500 billion. Chinese startup Ehang is looking to fly its passenger taxi drones in Dubai, the U.S., and other overseas countries in the coming year. We got exclusive access to its workshop and drone testing ground. Bloomberg News' Tom McKenzie reports.
The drudgery of your daily commute could be a thing of the past if the makers of this taxi drone get their way. Chinese startup Ehang plans to build a network of passenger drones in cities across the world. Company founder Hu Huazhi says that vision will soon be a reality.
We are now just waiting for our trial flight permits. When we have the permits, our taxi drones will be seen flying in Dubai and other countries publicly.
Where do you see the biggest growth opportunity? Is it the commercial drones, the consumer drones, or the taxi drones?
Definitely the commercial use drones and human carrying drones. If you look at the world, we are only at the beginning stages of the real large-scale usage of drones. And especially passenger drones, represented by Ehang 184 series, have just come to the attention of the public. Our company has just shifted our focus from technology to the commercial side of the business this year, as we see huge opportunities in the global market.
Is the biggest challenge for drone makers the regulatory environment? Is that still the #1 obstacle that you have to get over?
The civil aviation authorities in UAE and China have given us the green light for drone testing. In China, the US, and many other places, all the policymakers have put us in the center, working very closely with us every day on regulations. This is already very unusual.
Is China your prime focus in terms of a market, or are you looking overseas as well for sales?
The overseas market is indeed bigger than the Chinese market in terms of purchasing ability. However, we are making our way in China. For example, we've signed deals with 2 local governments and helped them build 2 control centers like this one for them to use our drones extensively in areas such as urban patrol and environmental monitoring. We've seen huge changes in our sales as more than half of our revenue came from commercial deals in China this year. I expect our passenger drones to bring us much more income next year. We have already secured a $1 billion order from the American company LUNG and formed a strategic partnership. Ehang 184 passenger drone will become a star in 2018.
You received $52 million in funding. Are you still looking for investors, or are you fully funded at this point?
We will kick off D-round funding targeting $300 million as we start mass production of our passenger drones at the beginning of next year. We also plan to install fully automated production lines to enlarge manufacturing capacity in 2018. Furthermore, we will sign deals in Saudi Arabia, Singapore, and several European sites where we will need funding to support drone testing.
Ehang were also putting their fleet of delivery drones through their paces when we visited, dropping off coffee from a local store. If regulators give this startup the green light, it is another service they hope will soon take off.
Bloomberg's Tom McKenzie there. Still ahead, the Justice Department has filed suit to stop AT&T's $85 billion takeover of Time Warner. And President Trump had this to say about the deal.
Well, I'm not going to get involved in litigation, but personally, I've always felt that that was a deal that's not good for the country. I think your pricing is going to go up. I don't think it's a good deal for the country, but I'm not going to get involved. It's litigation.
More on that story ahead. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to the Best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang. AT&T is telling the Trump administration, we will see you in court. This week, the U.S. Justice Department announced it is suing to block AT&T's $85.4 billion takeover of Time Warner. AT&T CEO Randall Stephenson says the suit stretches the idea of antitrust law beyond the breaking point. He is vowing not to sell CNN to appease the administration. This, of course, deals a major blow to the carrier's bid to create a media and telecommunications empire. Our Bloomberg Deals reporter Ed Hammond listened in on Monday's DOJ call and joined us right afterwards, along with our editor-at-large, Corey Johnson, and Bob O'Donnell of Technalysis. Take a listen.
They've said it's illegal. They've said it's harmful to consumers. Their rationale is essentially that, look, yes, it's a vertical merger, which traditionally you would see those deals fly through, but they're saying this just concentrates too much power in the hands of one company, in this case in AT&T, and it gives AT&T, I suppose, too much clout to determine which of its competitors get which content, to sort of prioritize its own stuff that it would be taking in through Time Warner. So it's a really, really interesting and almost unheard of kind of case for the Department of Justice to come out against what does, at least on paper, look like a very pure vertical merger.
And, Corey, in the weeks leading up to Makin Delrahim taking over this position at the Justice Department, it seemed like everything was moving forward. And now, suddenly in the last month, things have changed, which begs the question, is this politically motivated? Does this have to do with the president's dislike of CNN?
There has been some reporting, Jesse Eisinger out of ProPublica among them, saying that this really did come from the staff and this didn't come from the politically appointed people in the department. That the suggestion really was that this was about market concentration. Now, the lawsuit is certainly going to try to bring up whatever it can, including going into what the president has said, bringing up the things that the president has said both on Twitter and perhaps in private, to look at how that may have influenced the deal and just to kind of throw some mud at this thing. But this is a pretty tough suit, and the suggestion that it's a concentration of power is interesting to see from this this current FCC.
Bob, what's your read here?
Well, my take is, if in fact this is considered a consolidation of power, how do we think about Google, Facebook, all the big tech companies? Arguably, there's a lot more power and influence in those companies. So if I'm one of them, all of a sudden I'm more nervous because the regulatory environment suggests and the legal environment suggests that they could be going after large companies with influence. Ed, do you get the sense that this could have a broader ripple effect, or that this is very specific to this particular deal? No, it's absolutely going to have a broader ripple effect. I think there's sort of no way that this doesn't have, at least in the immediate term, sort of a chilling effect on big ticket M&A. This is, this is a sort of a case really about what we constitute power to be, because you had this traditional thing that power was something it was only to do in concentrated markets. This is really a question of absolute power, and if the DOJ take this to court and go through with it, and if they succeed in their case, you're going to see lots of people who would have done mergers sort of similar to this in terms of vertically integrating companies. They're going to have to think twice. So I think you're going to see people really pull back from some of the bigger, potentially more contentious deals, and then you throw in the unpredictability of Trump, and look, it's whether or not there was political interference, we don't know yet. Obviously, AT&T think there was. But Trump was very vocal that he didn't like this deal and he doesn't like CNN. And guess what? CNN is one of the main assets that the Department of Justice apparently have asked AT&T to divest from.
Randall Stevenson, the CEO of AT&T, Corey, has already said spinning off CNN is not an option, that they want CNN, but there is an opportunity here to negotiate. Could that be part of a negotiation?
Well, it looks like negotiation ended today, or probably ended a few days ago when the news of this came out. And the suggestion that CNN might get spun off and that would be okay with them, they might have worked that out before today, but now they're going to court. Now, we don't know really what was offered and not offered beforehand, or just behavioral changes that AT&T might have promised, as we've seen in earlier mergers. But it's important to also understand how CNN works within all of the cable empires at Time Warner. Time Warner is able to insist that if a cable carrier somewhere wants to carry CNN, they'll be told, you can have CNN if you take TNT, if you take TBS, if you take all of our other offerings. So Time Warner is able to sell many, many cable networks by having a crown jewel in CNN. It's not just a standalone business there. And that's why they have Headline and TBS and TNT on all these other carriage everywhere. And that's a great source of revenue for Time Warner. And as a result, you've got Time Warner really recognizing that they need to keep that as part of their business, and AT&T wanting to keep that as part of the Time Warner business.
We're actually getting headlines now out of the Justice Department, a Justice Department official saying that the lawsuit has nothing to do with President Trump, was not influenced by President Trump or anyone else in the White House.
But that doesn't mean it won't come up in the trial.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, and
that is the line, right?
I mean, of course they're going to say that, right? Obviously, they would have to say that.
The party line. Exactly.
It's absolutely the party line. But we do have to think about how people are consuming content.
Party line?
Yeah.
We're talking about AT&T? Oldie but a goodie, sorry.
We have to think about how people think about and consume media and content these days. And all of that is changing. Therefore, the rules, I think, are changing. And I think that's what we have to think about, the potential implications of what's going on here.
An AT&T Time Warner merger would pose a level of competitive harm not seen in decades. Okay, Ed, this is what a Justice Department official is saying. What is next? How does this process play out from here?
Well, it certainly doesn't sound like settlement language, does it? So, no, I think that they're obviously going to go to court on this one. It seems very unlikely that they're going to find some kind of resolution beforehand. AT&T genuinely believe they have a winnable case here. They think there has been some level of political interference, and they also think that this is without precedent. They actually said almost immediately when the Justice Department came out this afternoon, AT&T put out a very aggressive statement saying the lawsuit is a radical and inexplicable departure from decades of antitrust precedent. So they feel that this is the DOJ essentially overreaching, and they obviously will go to court and hope to win this case.
And what do you expect the consequences to be if this deal does not go through?
Well, I like Corey's point. Blame the bankers. It's always a good start. Look. I think if this
bankers don't think so.
If this doesn't go through, look across at what's happening at Fox at the moment. You have a number of companies that are trying to buy assets from Fox. This is, there is still a lot of potential acquirers for good content. So if this deal falls apart, and I think AT&T have until April before someone else could potentially come in and break this up, but it's entirely possible that you would see other suitors come in and try and buy either all or part of Time Warner. But I think if they go to court and this thing gets blocked, then it really is, it does not bode well for people attempting these big sort of contentious mergers.
That was Bob O'Donnell and Bloomberg's Ed Hammond, as well as our editor-at-large, Corey Johnson. Coming up, HPE announces a major executive leadership departure. We'll tell you about the next CEO as Meg Whitman wraps up almost 7 years at the helm. This is Bloomberg. On the earnings front this week, Salesforce reported a quarterly profit thanks in part to an expanded lineup of cloud-based programs. Revenue also rose 25% to $2.7 billion in the fiscal third quarter, but forecasts for fourth quarter profit missed estimates. CEO Mark Benioff has been looking to newer products, offering marketing and e-commerce services to increase growth and adding machine learning capabilities to attract more clients amid heightened competition from Microsoft and Oracle. And major leadership changes at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. CEO Meg Whitman will step down from her role effective February of next year, but will remain on the board. Antonio Neri will succeed Whitman as CEO. News of the executive reshuffle was announced with the company's fourth quarter report. The company reported over $7.5 billion in net revenue for the quarter, missing estimates. We caught up with our Bloomberg editor-at-large, Corey Johnson, and Crawford Del Prete, Executive Vice President of Research Products for IDC.
Look, Meg Whitman took on an apparently impossible job, which is to try to write Hewlett-Packard into a better and bigger business than it had been in the past, to restore it to the glory that Hewlett-Packard once had been as the leader in Silicon Valley. We saw a lot of changes at the company, most notably the split, taking Hewlett-Packard Enterprises, which is supposed to be the high-growth software services business, the router business, and as well as the low-growth printer and PC business, and spin that off on the other side. She went as CEO with what was supposed to be the high-growing business, but it didn't turn out that way. That business continued to shrink, notably. They continued to spend billions of dollars in acquisitions, and yet they are still taking write-downs. I mean, the restructuring charges in this quarter alone, they spent $10 million a week in restructuring charges. The restructuring charges, the one-time restructuring charges, go all the way back to 2001 with this company. That wasn't all her fault, but she couldn't find the right direction for this company to really resume its years of growth. The numbers they put out today on an adjusted basis show some growth, but if you really pull back the numbers, you see the most important divisions weren't growing, or certainly weren't growing any kind of size, that they maybe relied on a lot of leasing. They couldn't get the right product mix for today's world of technology.
President Antonio Neri will be taking over for her. We spoke to him a while back. I did ask him about his name being touted as the successor to Meg Whitman. Take a listen to what he had to say.
As you know, I've been in the company for 22 years, always in many different areas of the business, and I'm very excited about the future of this company.
Crawford Del Prete is now with us. Crawford, we were listening to Antonio Neri, who will be succeeding Meg Whitman there. You also, as I understand it, spoke with Meg herself, just got off the phone with her. First of all, what did she have to say?
Yeah, so obviously we talked about the quarter, but we also talked about her legacy. And I think what Meg, feels like is that Hewlett-Packard is innovating in a way that they weren't innovating when she arrived. I think if you look at the situation this company was in when she arrived, they were in a real haphazard situation with the exit of Leo Apotheker. I think that when you look at the playbook that they're running now, it's a playbook where they can innovate, and they do innovate. The problem is they still participate in a lot of relatively low margin segments. But I got to tell you, this company was irrelevant, heading toward irrelevance 3-4 years ago. The playbook of value-added sort of areas of the infrastructure that they can then add to their portfolio and sell through their channel is showing revenue growth. That revenue growth is something we haven't seen for a number of quarters. Now we've seen it in the second sequential quarter. So relatively, Meg and I talked about, the business is performing, better than it's been ever, performing, or at least in recent history. I think separate from that, you have to look at, how, is the job done? And I think that's the open question.
So tell us, who is Antonio Neri and what kind of leadership is he expected to bring to the company?
Yeah, I've had the pleasure of knowing Antonio for a long, long time, over 10 years. He is an HPer. He is an HPer pre-Compaq merger. I met him when he was running the customer support organization within the Personal Systems Group. He is the every HPer in the sense that he knows everyone. He's had so many jobs. He's climbed the corporate ladder, and he is extremely well regarded in the company. Meg made a comment to me when I spoke to her earlier, which was that when she joined, 60% of the top managers weren't from Hewlett-Packard. Now that number is completely reversed, and here we have the CEO having climbed the corporate ladder. So he's really well regarded within Hewlett-Packard, and he is a bit of a back to the roots of, he's climbed the corporate ladder, and he's kind of, taken his lumps internally and knows the organization in a unique way.
That was Crawford Del Prete of IDC and Bloomberg's Corey Johnson. Coming up, consolidation in the chip industry continues. Marvell rallies off its plan to buy Cavium for $6 billion. All the details next. Plus, it is a race between Alexa and Siri. Apple's HomePod is supposed to compete with Amazon's Echo, but is it too little too late? This is Bloomberg. In the battle of the voice-activated assistants, Apple may be losing out to Amazon in more ways than one. The HomePod is set to make its debut early next year, more than 3 years after the launch of the Amazon Echo. But it is not just about timing. Apple's device also lacks many of the capabilities that make the Echo such a hit. Mark Gurman, Bloomberg's consumer tech and Apple products reporter, joined us from LA.
Apple typically does this but comes out with something that leapfrogs the competition, a breakthrough. We saw this with the iPad, the iPhone, and the Apple Watch. What we're seeing with this Amazon Echo to HomePod situation is a product that's not only coming 3 years after Amazon's, but it totally misses the point in terms of what Amazon was hitting at. They're going after another category that people aren't necessarily asking for. People want a cloud-based device like the Alexa-powered Echo that can do everything for you, from ordering groceries to ordering lunch and dinner to making appointments and calling an Uber or a Lyft. What Apple's brought to the table here is a really great loudspeaker, something that other companies like Sonos have already established a footprint for.
Now, when I spoke to Tim Cook in June when they unveiled the HomePod, I asked specifically, does this mean Apple is interested in e-commerce or getting into e-commerce? And he said, no, I don't think so. In fact, you should really look at this as an audio device. That's where they think they're adding value. Take a listen to what Tim Cook told me.
Apple's a company that deeply cares about music and wants to deliver a great audio experience in the home. We feel like we reinvented it in the portable player area, and we think we can reinvent it in the home as well.
Is he right, Mark, that there is a desire to reinvent the audio experience in the home? Or is that not what customers want right now?
Well, let me take us all through some history. So in 2006, Steve Jobs at the time, as we know, the late Apple co-founder, unveiled a product called the iPod Hi-Fi. It was $350, just like the HomePod, and the pitch was to basically reinvent home audio and sound. That product didn't fare too well. Although this was 10 years ago, the product still was a massive flop for the company, a black eye. It was discontinued less than 2 years after it came out. Here's Apple 10 years later basically coming out with the same approach, a audio device, a speaker that sounds perhaps better than the competition and integrates with Apple's products better than the competition, but it's not really a true leapfrog product. It's not an advance like the iPhone, the Apple Watch, and the iPad were when they came out, not as the first devices in their respective categories.
So, you know, what do customers want? And is it e-commerce? And can we expect Siri via the HomePod to offer any of these features?
I mean, Alexa and the Echo has been a smash hit, surprisingly so, for an e-commerce giant like Amazon. And it basically can do everything with your voice. You can control your home, you can control your music. That's what the HomePod will be able to do, but the HomePod won't be able to do much beyond that. In terms of e-commerce coming to the HomePod, now, one of the key differences between the HomePod and the Echo is that the Echo is the product. The HomePod is an extension to the product, which is the iPhone. There are thousands of apps available through the cloud for Echo devices and other Alexa products, whereas the HomePod relies entirely on an iPhone for third-party applications, and not enough that it relies on the iPhone and it doesn't have its own ecosystem around it. The iPhone apps that work with it are limited to 3 categories: text messaging through apps like WeChat and obviously iMessage and maybe Facebook and Skype. But the other apps are just note-taking apps and to-do list apps. So it's a very limited subset of applications that are already limited to working with Siri that are going to work with a HomePod. I mean, this thing has a processor, a chip in it that comes straight from an iPhone, so it should be powerful. It should have all these enhancements in a full app ecosystem. Remember, Apple had all the tools to come out with a killer product like the Echo. It's had iTunes since the early 2000s. It's had Siri, and it was the first to mainstream voice activation since 2011. And obviously, Apple's been, you know, the king of the hardware industry in terms of making cool-looking, well-put-together products for several decades. It should have been Apple that came out with an Echo-like device, you know, 5 years ago, not Amazon.
That was Bloomberg's Mark Gurman. And a lot of movement in chip making this week. Marvell Technology has agreed to buy Cavium for about $6 billion in cash and stock. Marvell specializes in chips that control hard disk drives. That is a market that is no longer growing. Cavium makes network processors. Meantime, Qualcomm investors say they could be open to a Broadcom deal, but at a higher price. You will remember that Qualcomm's board rejected Broadcom's $105 billion acquisition offer. Bob O'Donnell of Technalysis joined us again, along with Bloomberg Intelligence's Anand Srinivasan, who focuses on the chip industry.
You step back and look at the big picture, we think that the combination actually makes sense, right? So this is it places adjacent parts of the cell phone together, and Hock Tan, the CEO of Broadcom, might be able to settle disputes with Apple, which has been the primary thorn in Qualcomm's side. If you're able to put that together, it adds a tremendous amount of value to Qualcomm, and hence to Broadcom, which is if it were to be acquired.
What about at the price on offer?
Look, insofar as is it possible that Hock Tan offers $5 more or $10 more to get the deal done? Yes. From our deal depth perspective, he's actually pretty well leveraged to try and make this deal happen. At the end of the day, you know, that $80 a share that people are angling for is also a psychological high price over the last 5 years. So, and Hock has historically not cowed to those higher price demands usually, and it might be a little bit of a barter transaction here as to whether the deal gets done at that price.
Obviously, there's been a ton of consolidation in the chip industry. I want you guys to take a look at a chart in the Bloomberg. G#BTV5038 shows you just how chip sales have been rising at their fastest pace since 2010. globally, and yet more consolidation, Bob, than ever, fewer players.
Well, I mean, the issue is, look, it's very hard to compete out there if you're a smaller specialized player. And what you're seeing is a conglomeration of different technologies being put together in these companies, right? I mean, think about what Intel has done. They went from just the CPUs, now they're competing on modems and FPGAs and all these other things. All of these companies recognize they've got to have a combination of different components, because across the board, whether it's automotive, compute, mobile phone, all IoT, all of these areas require multiple types of technologies, and that's going to be important. But one thing I'll throw out, two things I'll throw out there on the Qualcomm-Broadcom deal. Number one, obviously, there is a concern from a monopolistic perspective around Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. And you have to figure out what are they going to do, because there's too much control consolidated there. The other thing is, culturally, Broadcom and Qualcomm are different types of companies, and there is a concern, would that have an impact in terms of talent loss and things like that if this deal was to go through, because there has been discussion about that.
You know, that's a great point I want to make, but unlike other general consolidation, even large-scale consolidations, and this is not Intel Altera, right? And the difference being Hock Tan is in charge, right? He has a very
Someone said to me, Hock Tan gets what he wants, generally.
He has a very clear idea of what he wants, and he has a very clear idea of what segments he wants to keep, and more importantly, in semi-land, what segments he wants to divest, right? The Wi-Fi business is an overlap, and we think that it's a roughly $7 billion business that can be punted pretty quickly. The other part of it is we've thrown this idea, it's from far left field, but at the same time, if you were to somehow put a moat around QTL, which is the licensing portion of the business for Qualcomm, could that be sold off? And that could clear a whole host of problems from a regulatory perspective.
How does the Cavium Marvell deal fit into this, Bob?
Well, that one seems pretty straightforward. I mean, I think there's a nice combination of technologies there, and again, two relatively smaller players coming together. And what's interesting about that is there's this kind of general idea of edge computing that's growing, right? The idea of the cloud computing coming down to the edge, and this combination, and Cavium is now talking about ARM servers, and this combination would give them the capability to create some very interesting products or develop the components for products on the edge, and I think that could be a big deal for them.
Interestingly enough, the main competitor to both Marvell and Cavium is Broadcom.
Yes.
Well, Broadcom's going to be everyone's competitor at this rate, given how many companies.
And you know, their Hock Tan is.
You know, what are the consequences of that?
You got to be in semis, go big or go home.
Right.
Right. You cannot afford, and as Bob said, you cannot afford to be a small niche player and think that you're going to go somewhere, anywhere.
Right.
You have to have manufacturing capacity, you have to have product, and you have to have distribution channel, and you can't do that if you're a small company.
So I'll throw one out from left field. The only thing I thought of when I was thinking about this is, what if Samsung came in and said, you know what, we want Qualcomm? Because Samsung does, you know, raw components. They do screens, they do memory, they could do radios, you know, and certainly they've got the manufacturing. I'm not saying anything like that was ever going to happen, but when you think about ways that this world could go, that would not be the strangest deal ever done.
Thanks to Anand Srinivasan there of Bloomberg Intelligence and Bob O'Donnell, Technalysis Research President. And that does it for this edition of the Best of Bloomberg Technology. We will bring you all the latest in tech throughout the week. Tune in each day, 5 p.m. in New York, 2 p.m. in San Francisco. We'll be focusing in on driverless technology, as well as General Motors unveiling its latest car with no steering wheel. You won't want to miss it. And remember, all episodes of Bloomberg Tech are live streaming on Twitter. Check us out at Bloomberg Tech TV weekdays. That's all for now. This is Bloomberg.